This is the opening lecture of our symposium on the subject of spiritual frontiers. Spiritual frontiers continuously extend themselves. The masters of Atlantean times and of Lemurian times would not pass the third initiation today. The initiations of today are very much more complicated, difficult. They take into account a variety of energies which were not available in Atlantean times. Nevertheless, it is possible through careful study and research and personal experience to be able to break down the nature of where these initiations happen to a fairly fine art. What we have on the board here today is a very simple illustration of the planes of consciousness which mankind is able ultimately to embrace. Over here we have the physical world which gradually merges into the etheric. And we must identify ourselves straight away with the solid part of our world here, the liquid part of the world which interpenetrates the solid, the gaseous part of our world, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, which we know about very well. Then the world begins to break up into finer structures, like those of charged atoms, which we call ions. And this continues through three aspects of the etheric, which are shown at the top here as the first, second, and third planes. And so the part that I'm coloring in here represents the interpenetrating world of the anima mundi, the etheric world of our planet that interpenetrates the gas, liquid, and solid states. Now, we are more aware of this through our own physical bodies. The physical body incorporates these planes. The solid, liquid, and gaseous body we know very well, with its bones, with its tissues, and with its various muscular and nervous components. But the etheric part has been worked on lately, and we're beginning to understand more about it, about the subatomic particles that make it up. We're quite happy then in understanding the physical body of man as it is broken up into those 7 subplanes. We must, however, also consider the second of these major planes, which is the astral. And the astral, of course, is what we call emotional substance and its energies, the astral world. Similarly, in the astral world, you will encounter the solid parts of the emotional or astral world, the mountains, the various parts of your own astral body, which are semi-solid, as it were. You will find lakes and rivers and seas in the astral world, and they will be made up of this emotional component under liquid, the gaseous states, and so on. In the upper regions of the astral world are found the most ethereal kind of emotional substance. When we come out of body, of course, we begin to penetrate these higher regions. When we have a near-death experience and are flooded with energies of a higher being, we are really reaching up to these states here. And in a moment you'll see why this is particularly important to note. Because there now exists, of course, the mental plane, should put that in orange perhaps, the mental plane, and we are not totally conversant with the mental plane's nature because most of us have not developed a total mental structure. We're in the process of putting a mental body together. Certainly, most of us have got the lower mental structures of solid, liquid, and gas in our mental bodies, but this region here, the fourth or the ionic region of the mental world, only about a quarter of humanity has been able to take into its consciousness the elements of this fourth or ionic state of the mental world. Above that is what we call manas, the higher mental states. And these states constitute part of the spiritual world. They are states which are being penetrated by the finest consciousnesses of humanity. And we will, in this seminar, again and again, point to the nature of the heaven states as well as the loosely grouped spiritual conditions and how they are penetrated, what methods exist, and what styles of mental attitude can be adopted in order to reach into them. And so now we must consider what is the frontier between the world that we operate, mankind operates its consciousness in, and which constitutes the spiritual frontiers. The spiritual frontier is where we have marked this carefully. It is the dividing point between form states, or the rupic states, and the non-form states, or arupic. These structures formed here, images, perhaps symbols, have identification about them, but they are not grouped under what we would call form matter. And so we have this important frontier. The next plane is the plane of Buddhi, the plane of compassion, of love, love wisely applied, wisdom lovingly applied. It is the place where we are able to draw intuition from. Intuition is its sensory perception. These perceptions here we are more or less aware of, but the perception of Buddhi is not quite so controllable. In fact, we're lucky if we have 10, 20 experiences of intuition in a whole lifetime. Nevertheless, they emerge from this whole spiritual plane. You will note now that it is possible, therefore, to enter the Buddhic state from the mental planes. Very important. We're so used to thinking of prayer and so used to thinking of mantras, all of which are important, no doubt about that. But the importance of understanding the spiritual frontier is that many of the entries into the plane of Buddhi are laterally, or if you like, horizontally, and not vertical. Whereas here, you see that it's possible from the highest planes of the astral to reach into the mental, to the monastic world, which is part of the spiritual. And there are certain emotional, if you like, devotional, aspirational attitudes that enable us laterally to enter the spirit world. We will be coming back to this illustration as the day wears on. I must at this stage point out the third of the spiritual planes that are encompassable by man. We've talked about Manas, the higher part of the mental plane. We've talked about the whole plane of Buddhi, and we must take into account also the plane of will, of divine will. And generally speaking, you won't get very far in your studies without having to grasp the essential fact of the three major spiritual planes of Atma, Buddhi, and Manas. Atma, Buddhi, and Manas, for they are your target of attention. It is surprising that although Atmic is considered such a high plane of spiritual achievement, that it is possible to pull Atma down by tremendous acts of attention or focus, to pull it down, right down even into the physical states, where you have an athlete struggling against all kinds of difficulties, lack of oxygen, too much lactic acid, muscular contraction, and yet able to get to the winning post by calling on every resource that the athlete has and focusing his attention on the winning post, and down comes the Atma. Sometimes the Atma descends when there is an accident has occurred and a child has been pinned by a log, and the father rushes up to the log in absolute desperation and intention to save the child, and lifts the log up, and the child is able to clamber clear, and later everyone is amazed that this person could pick up such an object, perhaps 1/2 or 3/4 of a ton. And it is, of course, through the sudden injection of Atma. And Atma must be considered as being a tool, an instrument of the divine. The beings who inhabit the divine are capable of intervening in our lives through the exercising of these faculties. The monadic levels and the logoic are not of our consideration today. Not that they have to be ignored, but they are beyond the grasp of a public lecture, at least for my presentation. And so we have seen that we have got an astral body which draws its emotional energy through the solar plexus chakra from the astral plane. We have seen that we have a rather poorly developed mental structure in the process of being put together, and that this mental structure is suitable for everyday active intelligence, but when we start to demand more and more of it, demand thinking not just linearly in a single line of objective thought, but to be able to think along several lines or linear planes at once. And then we have to call in Manas. But at the moment, the mental body is partly integrated for most of us, and we must remember that. Any act of visualization, any capacity to be able to put there between the eyebrows in the sacred square inch an object for meditation. And my students know well that I have given many methods of obtaining this. Any ability to visualize penetrates into the higher mental part of the spiritual world, the arupic spiritual world, because you are creating not a form, even though it is a living thing, you are creating here an image, a visualized structure. You will be surprised to know, possibly, that many businessmen focusing arduously on some very difficult and protracted project also penetrate into this region. Their experiences are often brushed aside, and we can't expect them to clothe those experiences in the kind of mystical language that you and I can understand. Many scientists develop the capacity to visualize as part of their scientific repertoire. Many scientists love to read the science comics or the science magazines, where there is tremendous visualization. You'd call it imagination, but here it is deliberately laid down for a specific purpose, and it begins to penetrate into the monastic world. Whereas here, naturally, as you would expect in the astral world, you have many devotees of the Christ or of the Buddha, reaching into the highest levels of the emotional world. Perhaps through their highest devotions, they can reach the highest levels of the astral world. And as you go higher, naturally, it is easier to penetrate the spiritual frontier. And so that is the opening suggestion that I have made for our subject here today. We have been on this planet a short time. Mankind has been on the planet about 15 million years. Slowly, science is pushing the age of man back more and more. Originally, it was 40,000 years that science anthropologists regarded the age of man on the planet. Then it crept up to 500,000 years, then to 1 million, and now it's knocking on 4 and 5 million. Eventually, it will be found that there is no missing link that connects us to the animal kingdom in an anthropological sense through bones and fossils and so on. But that an event had occurred early in the history of mankind on this planet, which had speeded the process of change from animal state into human extremely rapidly. Now, spiritual growth, the instrument by which we penetrate frontiers of the spiritual world, spiritual growth is associated with the expansion of two qualities. First of all, there is the expansion of awareness, of consciousness. We cannot penetrate, even with the assistance of nitrous oxide in the dentist's chair, or ecstasy in some dark alley, or whatever method is employed. We do not penetrate the higher worlds. We may enter into the environs of them, but we do not penetrate them with any degree of progress unless we are able to expand our awareness. You have heard me, my students have heard me many times say that when you begin to tread the path of unfoldment, when you begin to tread that path, there are certain characteristics that emerge naturally from it and tell you, that reaffirm again and again, yes, you're on the path. And one of these is, of course, the expansion of consciousness. And by that we mean expansion of the awareness so that it doubles itself every year. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. And that indeed is a confirmation to you. That's why it's so important to keep a spiritual diary, to be able to look back in your diary and see what progress you have made. The spiritual, may I use the words, ambitions or aspirations that I had when I was a youngster of 28 and 29, and which I thought then were outrageous. Perhaps to be able to be seated at the master's table. Those aspirations have long, long since been passed by totally new awareness that I was never, all right, can I use the word again, conscious of when I was a young man. And this whole process of doubling the consciousness so that in 5 years you are 32 times more conscious than you were 5 years previously is accelerated by it going up in geometrical proportion. 1, 2, 4, 16, 16 squared, and so on. And that process is only achieved through what we call initiation. And initiation is a method, an attempt to try and open the gates into these higher regions for mankind, deliberately so, not just by those individuals who have struggled through desperate measures, sometimes not just through meditation or through focusing the mind or studying or serving, but by other means have struggled along that path to reach perfection, succeeded, and remain in the precincts of the planet to help man, not just through that, but through a completely extra-systemic intervention. Intervention coming from beings who exist outside of our solar system, immense cosmic entities, inconceivable to us now as all this was inconceivable to me at the age of 28 and 29. And we call this process of extending the awareness initiation. But it is not alone. We need something to bear the extended awareness, to carry the extended awareness. And this is only possible through experiencing also simultaneously with the expansion of consciousness what we call the expansion of the life force flowing through us. And so initiation applies 2 factors. And the factors are increase of awareness, massive increase of awareness, and the intrusion of extra life force through the vehicle, through those chakras, through those nadis, be they the large ones of Ida, Sushumna, and Pingala, or the tiny little filaments that are inter-chakra-wise, to allow this structure, which we call our vehicles, to bear the load of that extended awareness, and therefore to take more life force into us. The change of animal, hominid, into human occurred, of course, in this same way. An energy that comes from the sun, and we will see from what part of the sun today, via Venus, and we mean one of the inner vehicles of Venus, one of the inner globes of Venus, through the directed minds of great beings who were living on Venus, and the civilization I'm talking about is around ahead of us, 50 million years ahead of us. Through their intervention, they were able to take the fire of mind stemming from the sun and to direct it through a process known as Kriya Yoga into the stimulating of the cortex of the highest anthropoids on our planet. And this produces great changes, mutations to the genes and chromosomes of that particular species, and none others, or hardly any others, were eligible and therefore died out. Produced mutations in the active part of the DNA molecules, as well as in those parts of the DNA molecules which are apparently inactive and which science calls nonsense DNA. But they did intervene. And the fires that they employed, called upon, used, came from behind the sun, and we want to know today what lies behind the disk of the sun, in detail if possible. The Egyptians were caught up in a religion that was like the apes on our planet, slowly going into regression because they hadn't got the brain capacity to expand their awareness. An Akhenaton, an initiate pharaoh, was able to unravel something of initiate knowledge of what exists behind the disk of the sun. And he was able to institute it, albeit temporarily, a new religion. A new religion that recognized there was one God, and that divine entity was behind the disk of the sun. And that was the new religion that he tried to introduce. It was also the basis of the religion of monotheism that was the basis of the Jewish religion some 1,000 or so years later. And so there are different fires that come to us from the disk of the sun. There are the fires of what Alice Bailey called fire by friction, the fire that you see in a forest burning the brush, the fire that you see in your grate at home, the fire that you know exists in the combustion of oxygen and glucose in your own cells, fire by friction. Then there is this fire we've been talking about, the fires of mind, and they come from a different part of the sun. And lastly, there is that extraordinary fire, the third fire from the sun, which Blavatsky called Fohat, and which Alice Bailey called electric fire. And this electric fire is used on the highest initiates. Initiates who are held between two adepts, as a rod of initiation applies the electric fire to the 7 centers on the cortex of the brain. And so you and I think of initiation in terms of a rod of initiation. There it is. We think of it as a rod, or in England we would call it a wand or rod of initiation. And it brings with it an increase of life force. An increase of life force, and with it also that which we call a step up in awareness that I have just described. And so this is a symbol of initiation. It is also, of course, the symbol of the brain and the spinal column or cord within it, and the ability through high spiritual development to leave the body behind, and the wand becomes winged. In the Old Testament, it grows leaves on, or leaves sprout from the stem of this rod. And so there is symbolically this rod of initiation, and it is applied to raise the extension, or rather to raise the awareness of devotees, of chelas taking the path of initiation. But you would understand from this that this requires discipline to bear such extensions of awareness. Good heavens, some of us can't even bear the awareness of a tragedy in our own lives. How are we then able to deal with the extensions of consciousness that come with initiation? Let us now look at the sun. This great disk that Akhenaton worshipped and taught the Egyptians to worship, and how it was depicted in the Egyptian murals as being a god behind the sun who handed down the virtues to man, the capacities of man's expanding consciousness. There was no question about that in his mind. The true nature of the sun still escapes science. We know very little about what goes on behind that spinning, shining disk. There are anomalies especially with regard to the sun's magnetism. We must understand that the sun is 1,000,000 miles across. That disk is 1,000,000 miles across. And we have to stretch our awareness to embrace some of the considerations of what lies behind that disk. Occult tradition says that we are part of 3 solar systems. A solar system that has manifested and ended in a great supernova and then collapsed into itself and became a body, which we'll leave to later to describe, and that there will be another manifestation of our solar system, which is our present one, and still one more to come in the eons ahead. The solar system that was male. It was a solar system that organized the atoms, helped to fashion out of the crudest material released by the Big Bang, as it were, into atoms which we understand something of today. But then, after a great pralaya, an interval period, the second solar system of which we are a part began to manifest. It is a female solar system. It is the solar system expressing the energies of love, wisdom. And therefore, in the end, always remember that you can fall back if you are too bewildered or confused. Fall back to the roots which we all possess, which lie within that love-wisdom solar system. And the desire to produce a gentler manifestation of our planet is well understandable in terms of what I've just told you. The sad truth is that the life on this planet evolved through nature red in tooth and claw, that one species of animal fought with another for dominance and was able to live through the sacrifice of lower, less powerful creatures. And for us to have to be the spearhead to implant love wisdom into such a background of descent from animal states is very hard indeed. Alice Bailey said, I certainly concur, this is not the only universe, that there are millions of universes. We are just one moderate universe within millions. And later on, we must consider how to accept such a proposition and retain it in our consciousness, or allow it to expand what elements we have in our consciousness already. That concept implies all sorts of things to us. First of all, we must understand that behind the disk of the sun, let's say that's 1,000,000 miles, behind the disk of the sun, there's the disk, there lies a body which is said to be cool, is not the flaming incandescent mass of temperature 30 million plus, but that there is an inner structure there. In astrology, it's the basis of our calling the sun a planet. In fact, what is there is a neutron star. What is there is a neutron star. And the neutron star has an iron shell. It's probably 20 miles wide. Now that's tiny compared to the million miles of the disk of the sun. It has a diameter, say, of 20 miles. And half a mile of that 20 is an iron shell. An iron shell. And inside this iron shell, there are the myriads, countless billions of packed neutrons. A neutron is a combination of a charged particle we call a proton, and it is positive, with an electron, which is negative, and these two together make a structure called a neutron, and they are found in all atoms, in all elements, I should say. And so there is, nobody can say what it looks like. Nobody can say what this planet of 19 miles diameter manifests as. The only thing we know about it is that it is tremendously dense, dense beyond anything conceived in the past, dense to the extent of being 100 million times the gravitational pull of our Earth. And these are scientific factors about ordinary neutron stars. The difficulty is science doesn't believe there's anything behind the disk except an immense furnace. And so there is this structure with an immense gravitational pull, wrapped around with an iron skin, if you like, and it is magnetic. Any mass ball of material moving, rotating, if you like, creates a magnetic field around it. And this structure is the basis of that great magnetic field which pours out from the sun. Great magnetic field, North Pole up here, perhaps South Pole down here, and we feel it on the Earth. We feel it on the Earth where our Earth's own magnetic field interplays with it, And when it does so, the magnetic field of the sun can cause the magnetic field of the Earth to wobble, and we can have atmospherics and all kinds of problems with communication. The next thing we know is, therefore, that this magnetic field holds back the photosphere of the sun, which is a region of the sun right on its periphery in which there are nuclear explosions. And these nuclear explosions are productive of immense power, heat, light, and then beyond that we have the chromosphere, which is the outpourings of the surface of the sun, which gives us our light and our heat. It is the magnetic field that holds back the nuclear forces from completely occupying this immense space. And so, in esoteric parlance, we recognize three areas of the sun. There is, first of all, the central spiritual sun, which is the neutron content. There is the surface of the inner globe, which gives off its magnetic field and holds back the nuclear furnaces, the effect of them, and we call this the heart of the sun. And then there is the surface of the sun making up that disk, which sustains the forms on the earth in a fire by friction. And that is called the disk of the sun, the disk of the sun. And you will find this immensely valuable if you begin to penetrate your occult studies. The three conditions of the sun and the three fires: electric fire, solar fire, and fire by friction. One sustains form. This one produces an evolution of the different species on our planet, prods them towards evolution, and is the receiver and transmitter of what we call the seven rays through the heart of the sun. When we come to the central spiritual sun, we know that an immense force in a different dimension from anything physical, coming from Vega, the pole star, the North Star, stimulates this central spiritual sun. And this central spiritual sun produces emissions. And these emissions are electrons, which are charged particles, and they are neutrinos, which are neutral particles, and it is these that reach the Earth, and the electrons enter the Earth's atmosphere in the North Pole, and the Earth's atmosphere is a reservoir for these electrons. The electrons carry prana, and they carry an electrical charge which is negative. They reach into the atmosphere of the Earth where they are stored, and it is from the storehouse of electrons with negative charge that the electricity of the planet is derived. That the electricity of the planet is derived. How does one obtain this information? Partly through study, but mainly through the assistance of higher beings. There's always a higher being, no matter who you are, even if you are a planetary logos or a solar logos or the grand man of the heavens. They all have a higher being. And it's an important concept, as we will see later on this afternoon, because there is this discussion going on now on the planet. Are we going to be able to break out from the Earth? Are there any barriers to our moving into the space around the Earth? Within the solar system, perhaps reaching Jupiter, perhaps one of the moons of Saturn, and beginning to colonize and extract the wealth of those structures for the Earth as the population of the Earth explodes. Some say it could go up to 1,000 million from 1,000 billion from the 6 billion that it is today, in which case, obviously, such exploration and colonization of the solar system would be imperative. And can we go beyond? Can we, in fact, penetrate outer space, reach the stars? Oh, it all sounds lovely because we've been baptized by Hollywood. And that's nothing to Hollywood. The indications are, esoterically, that there can be no escape from the solar system by merely sending rockets up, or capsules, or saucers, or whatever is figured. The exit to the solar system is going to have to be through the heart and central spiritual core of the solar system. We will see this afternoon why that is so, why that is not going to be avoided. But we can do it. And the way we do it is to discard the physico-etheric body temporarily, to come out of it, to move in the astral body, perhaps to the surface of the sun, and then to be able to shift consciousness into the mental body, which in some individuals will be highly integrated, and in the mental body to go to the nearest stars, thus cutting out the most important need of all, the barrier, and that is the need for prana, which science hasn't even discovered yet, though its existence has been taught for 4,000 years. I have been on the surface of that inner cool body, in an astral body, or an astro-mental one. It was an incredible experience, which I shall never forget, though I will and have forgotten many physical ones. To be able to walk on the surface of this rotating body. And so small is it that as you walk, you feel as if you're falling forward, because it is rotating and you are on it and you are walking and you are carried downwards, it seems, all the time as it rotates. And to register the different experiences on the surface of this inner structure. But the greatest experience of all is to look upwards and see this immense arc here of exploding atomic devices and the great convection of currents that produce towers of incandescent flame right across above you. Take the highest, take the greatest orb that you can imagine, the greatest width of a curve that you can imagine, and then know that it goes much further that way and much further that way, and see this as a canopy over your head of towering furnaces in which exploding gases, nuclear explosions, the heat and light of that thrown upwards, not downwards. There's a big magnetic field there to hold it in place. I was at El Alamein. There were 25,000 cannons there that formed the barrage on the 23rd of October, 1942. It was the greatest spectacle most of us young soldiers had ever seen, in which the sky lit up and in which the guns were firing faster than machine guns. So many of them were there. And these were shells exploding. Well, the noise that was given off from this extraordinary experience was a mighty rumble. And I can conceive of that mighty rumble being the sound of the Om. That sound that you feel when you're right out in nature by yourself. Sometimes you hear it in a factory with all the electric generators going. Woo, 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 woo. Well, we'll talk about that later on. But that was my experience, and it helped me, of course, to put together many of the loose fragments, and there are many, many more to come. But it does give us a basis for understanding something of the spiritual frontiers that lie ahead of us. And when somebody's been there, and I'm sure others will do it, and when somebody's been there, it's so much easier, isn't it, to know that somebody has been there. And the concept, perhaps 5 million years, the concept of quietly leaving your physical body in a proper state of care and attention on the earth and undergoing certain ceremonial procedures to leave the physical body and to enter into transfer to the heart of the sun, and from there by other formula to go to one of the near stars, like Sirius, 4 light years away. And that's an awful long distance. It takes only 8.5 minutes for the light of the sun to reach us, and the sun is 93 million miles away. And so if you take 4 light years, it's a long, long way away for those stars, and they are the closest. But consciousness has reached there. There are beings in our solar system who are aware of the importance and the nature of the giant star Sirius. And this is going to be the only way, conceivable way, in which it's going to be possible to transfer to such structures, quietly leaving behind the physical body. Why use it when you don't need it? And transferring extra-systemically to these great bodies. We have to remember that we are not the only civilization in the solar system. I used to ponder that we must be halfway in development if there are other systems out there, and there are. But you have to ask yourself the question, are we talking about technological development on the earth? The structure of our homes, our bridges, our highways, and so on? Or are we talking about spiritual development? That is necessary if you're going to consider this. How far are we on the road to development? Technologically, quite far advanced, more than above average. Spiritually, if you're going to mark it out of 10, probably 4 out of 10. For we are a non-sacred planet, and we need to know about that in spiritual frontiers. Technologically, about 6 out of 10. There are other systems. The most advanced, which you could put at, say, 9 or 10 out of 10, is in the constellation of Gabriel. There are others in the constellation of Cetus the whale, and of course on Sirius. We're there. We're beginning to probe, and we haven't shifted outside of our planet yet, really, we humans. And there are barriers to our going out into space. Barriers such as weightlessness, the impact of weightlessness. You don't hear a lot about the physiology of weightlessness. Oh, the experiments are going on. A whole flight recently was devoted only to the physiology of weightlessness. I'm quite sure that there are problems arising now that were not anticipated before. And weightlessness has a devastating effect on man. Not that I think that that alone would bar him from reaching the other planets, but there are other things. I'll close with that. Thank you.